They tied the paralyzed Apache girl to the rancher's mailbox as a joke, but he took her in.
Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from.
The sound of wind scraping dry grass across packed dirt was the only thing moving that early. The sun was slow to rise over the ridge east of Wither Hollow, and Adam had already been up 2 hours. He was standing by the barn with one hand resting on the doorframe, checking for loose hinges. Behind him, the yard sat still. Nothing but scattered chicken feed, a sagging fence, and a half-dead cottonwood tree that split the land in two. Adam was 40, broad-backed, thick-armed, with the quiet air of a man used to isolation. His face carried sun lines deep at the edges, and his beard came in patchy with more gray than brown these days. 5 years alone on the same 30 acres had hardened the shape of him. He didn't walk fast, didn't waste gestures, didn't bother with town unless the stock needed salt or the tools needed sharpening. He had no wife, no children, no family left but the grave out back where his brother lay. This land didn't have much to offer, but it was his. He didn't ask for more. That morning, he was heading for the southern fence row. A rail had split under snowfall last week, and he'd set aside time to fix it before winter pressed in again. He gathered nails into a pouch, slung it over his shoulder, and stepped off the porch with a measured limp. The right leg never healed clean after the cavalry days. The pain was old. It didn't bother him the same way it used to. His path took him toward the narrow trail that bent westward, past the rusted post where an old tin mailbox hung crooked. It hadn't held a letter in 3 years. Most days, he didn't even notice it. But today, something was wrong. From 50 feet away, Adam saw it. A human figure slumped low against the post. He stopped walking. His hand moved slowly toward the knife hooked at his side, not in panic but in habit. His eyes narrowed. Shape, size, position, he read those things first. Young woman. Small, slouched in a way that didn't look like sleep. No hat, no coat, no movement at all. He exhaled through his nose and stepped forward. As he got closer, details sharpened. Her hands were bound behind her back with rough, fraying rope. Her legs were stretched out in front of her, motionless, half covered with a torn piece of burlap. She had dark braids pulled back tight, though loose strands stuck to her cheek where sweat and dust had dried. Her lips were cracked. Her breathing was shallow. The skin around her mouth had gone pale, but her eyes, wide and black, were awake. Watching him, she didn't speak. Adam stood over her for a few seconds, not saying anything. His heartbeat picked up, not from fear, but from the sick understanding of what kind of person had done this. He looked at her wrists. Rope burns. One of them had a small cut that hadn't bled clean. This wasn't fresh. She'd been out here a while. He didn't recognize her face. Probably Apache, maybe from the scattered camps east of the ridge. She couldn't have walked here, not with how her legs were lying. Useless, unmoving. Paralyzed? Injured? There was no way to know. Not yet. She still hadn't asked for help. Adam crouched slowly beside her. The rope was tight enough to have cut into skin. He pulled a small blade from his belt, just a rusted pocket knife he used for feed sacks, and leaned in close without touching her. She didn't flinch. He cut the first loop, then the second, until her arms fell forward into her lap. She caught herself with her elbows and held steady, though he could tell it cost her strength. He didn't know what to say. Wasn't sure words would matter. "Can you move?" he asked finally. His voice was low, worn down by disuse. She didn't answer, just shifted her eyes down toward her knees. That was answer enough. Adam stood, looked once over each shoulder, then reached down and hooked his arms under her back and legs. She let him. No panic, no stiffening, just a calm that unsettled him more than resistance would have. She weighed nearly nothing. As he carried her, Adam's thoughts clicked through questions. Who did this? Why her? Why here? The closest town was 2 miles off, and only a handful of boys in Wither Hollow would be cruel enough to think this was funny. He'd kept himself long enough that folks stopped caring whether he was alive or dead. But someone had remembered him. Someone had chosen his land, his post, as the place to leave her. Inside the cabin, it was warm from the morning stove fire. He laid her down on the cot, near the corner wall, where the light came in soft through the only unbroken window. He fetched a blanket, draped it across her legs without fuss, then stepped back to let her breathe. Her eyes followed his movements. Still not a word. He poured water from the jug into a tin cup, walked it over, and set it near her hand. She reached slowly, lifted it with both hands, drank all of it without spilling. Then she set it back on the table beside her. Adam pulled a chair from the kitchen and sat against the far wall, not facing her directly. There was nothing to ask yet, nothing to offer. The woman didn't cry, didn't explain herself. She just lay there, breathing slow, her arms resting limp, her eyes adjusting to the dimness. Adam stared at the floor. He would have to build a ramp, would have to move things around to make space. He didn't know if she was staying or even if she'd survive the night. But she'd been left on his land, and now she was in his house. That made her his responsibility, whether she wanted to be or not. Outside, the wind shifted again, knocking the empty tin mailbox against the post until the hinge creaked and fell still. Adam didn't fix it. Not yet. By the time the first frost rolled in that night, Adam had already cleared the porch. He used the lantern only briefly, just enough light to sort through the scrap wood stacked under the lean-to behind the barn. There are still boards left from when he rebuilt the chicken pen last spring, narrow ones, good grain, not warped from weather. He tested each with his boot before dragging them toward the house. His breath showed in the cold now. The air had gone dry and sharp. Inside, she hadn't moved. She lay where he'd set her, shoulders half propped by the wall, her hands resting in her lap, eyes open but unfocused. He noticed she hadn't touched the second cup of water he'd left. The fire in the stove had burned low, so he added a few more split logs without saying a word. She watched the motion, eyes tracking his arm as he closed the iron door. Still nothing spoken. Adam didn't need it. He worked until just after midnight, hands stiff, nails bending from the knots in the boards. The ramp started at the porch lip and angled down to the yard, held up by rocks packed into the earth and stakes hammered in tight. He built it wide enough for wheels, though he wasn't sure how or when he'd find any. It didn't matter. The house had to be accessible now. It was simple as that. By morning, she was awake before him. When he came in from the barn with a bucket of water and hay still clinging to his cuffs, she was sitting upright, both arms braced against the cot frame, her fingers white from gripping. Her hair had fallen out of its braid, most of it draped across her shoulder in loose strands. She'd shifted her body slightly toward the door, like she'd tried to move herself in the night. Her legs hadn't budged an inch. He noticed a small scrape on her forearm. No blood, just raw skin. She looked at him, then at the floor, and back again. Still silent. He didn't ask what she'd been trying to do. There was only one answer. He set the water down near her and walked into the side room. Bare, but for an old stool and a crate with torn shirts he used as rags. He picked one of the cleaner ones, came back, and handed it to her. She didn't take it right away. Only after he set it beside her did she lift it with one hand and begin wiping her arms. Her fingers moved slowly, but with purpose. They were calloused. Adam stood for a moment, just watching. Then he pulled the extra chair near the stove and sat down, boots heavy on the floorboards, arms resting on his thighs. "What's your name?" he asked, eyes on the fire. Her voice, when it finally came, was hoarse from disuse. "Taya." He nodded, said nothing back. Her gaze dropped to the blanket covering her legs. She moved the edge with 2 fingers, checking underneath, then let the fabric fall again. There was no reaction on her face. No wince. No denial. Adam stood again, slower this time. He moved toward the kitchen counter, opened a tin of beans, and spooned half into a pan. He worked quietly, the only sound coming from the stove warming up again and the clatter of tin on iron. Taya didn't speak after that. She stayed alert, tracking his steps, his pauses, his choices. When he set the bowl in front of her, beans, a piece of cornbread, and a cut of dried apple, she blinked once but gave no thanks. She didn't owe him that. He pulled the table closer to her side, sat on the other end, and ate from his own plate in silence. When they finished, he took her dish, cleaned it with water from the basin, then looked at her once before heading outside again. He had a task now. It wasn't complicated. He needed to find wheels. Not store-bought. Town wouldn't have them anyway. not the kind he could afford. What he did have was an old wagon out back with a broken axle and 2 good wheels still attached. He hadn't touched it in years. By noon, he dragged the wagon closer to the shed. He used a hammer and wedge to loosen the rusted bolts, wood creaking loud under strain. When one will finally came free, it dropped sideways with a clatter that startled the hens across the yard. Inside the house, Taya didn't move. But her eyes were different when he came back. Sharper, focused. She'd seen the effort through the window. She hadn't asked for help, hadn't made a sound, and yet he was building something for her. Adam worked until his hands were raw and his back pinched between the shoulders. He didn't stop to explain. He didn't need her permission. He just kept at it. And by nightfall, 2 wheels leaned against the cabin wall. Dirty, worn, but solid. The frame he'd build tomorrow. No one had said the word stay, but she hadn't left, and he hadn't made room for any other outcome. The next morning brought fog. Low, heavy, and thick enough that the hills vanished past the edge of the chicken coop. Damp air coated the porch rails and darkened the wood under Adam's boots as he stepped outside. His coat was already pulled tight and buttoned high, a fresh splinter caught in his cuff from the early hours he'd spent measuring wood planks on the floor inside. He had already cleared a space by the stove, moving the table and shifting the chairs to build in the warmth. The ground outside was too slick to work, and Taya, still propped upright on the cot, watched him without a word as he sorted bolts, lined the wheels against the wall, and tested weight across each support beam with the heel of his palm. She hadn't asked what he was doing, but she knew. Her eyes followed each movement. Focused, calm. Still no gratitude offered, but no resistance either. Not once did she ask him to stop. Adam didn't speak much either. He focused on the frame, cut the lengths with a handsaw until his knuckles turned white, fit the crossbars together, and drove nails deep into the grain. He was building a chair, not fine, not elegant, but something solid, something she could push, something that belonged in the house now. By midday, the fog hadn't lifted. It clung to the yard like a sheet and made the interior feel dimmer than it was. Adam lit the oil lamp on the mantel and worked in its glow. He wiped sweat from his brow with the back of his wrist, dirt mixing with old scars along his temple. He hadn't spoken since sunrise. Taya shifted on the cot once, moving her upper body to sit straighter. Her hands reached down and gripped the edge of the blanket that covered her legs. She didn't look away from the chair being built in front of her. Adam stopped only once, stepping away to pour her fresh water and leave a chunk of boiled potato and hard biscuit on the table near her. She accepted both silently, ate in slow, steady bites, using both hands, the plate balanced carefully across her lap. When finished, she pushed the empty dish slightly aside and turned her face back toward the build. Outside, the wind had shifted direction. The fog was beginning to break apart in long threads. The sun hadn't shown itself, but enough light bled through the clouds to cast pale rectangles across the floorboards near the door. Adam didn't notice. He was already lowering the chair frame, testing how it sat flat. The balance was off by a fraction, and he adjusted it without frustration. Just practical movements. He ran a hand along the edge, made a mental note to file the corner smooth later. He paused when he felt her eyes on him again. She hadn't looked away, and this time there was something different in it. Recognition, not of the object, but of the time, the hours, the attention. Not once had he asked who she was before, not where she came from, not how she'd ended up bound to his fence post. Now he did. "Who left you there?" he asked, his voice low but direct. Taya didn't answer right away. Her gaze dropped to the cot's edge. She pressed her palm flat against the wood, then glanced at the unfinished chair, then back at him. "Boys," she said quietly. "How many?" "3. From Wither Hollow." She nodded once. Adam's jaw shifted as he processed that. He stood fully upright, wiped his hands clean on his trousers, and moved to the shelf where his tools were kept. He began sorting them without comment. Taya spoke again, unexpected but steady. "They said no one would care if I died out there." Adam didn't reply. He placed the chisel back on the shelf and walked to the door, opened it, and stepped outside for a moment. The air was colder now, but the fog had thinned enough that the barn was visible again. He stayed out for a full minute, just breathing. When he returned, she hadn't moved. but her hands were folded over her stomach, her fingers still. He walked past her, grabbed the oil lamp, and turned it down slightly. The glow dimmed. "Chair will be done tomorrow," he said plainly. She gave a slow nod. Then, finally, she spoke something more. "I'll use it." He looked at her, this time holding her gaze longer than before. "All right," he said. That was all. That was enough. The room went quiet again, but not cold. Not distant. It was a shared quiet now. Chosen. Not empty. And somewhere, underneath it, the shape of something new had begun to settle between them. Neither one said it out loud, but both stayed in it. Fully. Completely. The hammering started before sunrise. Each strike echoed flat across the land, bouncing off frost-covered brush and brittle fence posts. The sky was a dull strip of gray behind the hills, not yet split by sunlight, and the air bit at exposed skin hard enough to sting. Inside, the stove glowed low and steady. Taya remained awake in the cot, watching from her place against the far wall. Her arms were crossed over her lap, and her back rested against the plank frame with quiet purpose. She hadn't said anything since the evening before. She didn't ask about the noise, didn't shift position, didn't blink as dust stirred from the floor beneath Adam's boots. He'd moved the nearly finished chair into the center of the room. Now he was drilling through the axle rod, sweat darkening the front of his shirt despite the cold. Each movement had weight. There was no wasted effort. He paused only to wipe his palm against the back of his thigh or to reach for a bolt left on the table beside the bread tin. The wheels, salvaged from the old wagon, had been cleaned, scraped of rust, and coated with the oil he kept in a chipped glass bottle for hinges and rifle parts. They weren't pretty, but they rolled smooth. He tested them again and again, bending close to listen for any grind or looseness. When satisfied, he fit them onto the iron rod, secured them with washers, and rolled the base across the floor once to feel it move underweight. Taya didn't react until he crouched beside the cot. Her breath shortened slightly. "I'm going to lift you," he said, calm and clear. "It'll take a minute." She gave a short nod. No fear showed, but her fingers pressed harder into the blanket as he slid one arm beneath her shoulders and the other behind her knees. Her body tensed as he lifted, part reflex, part strain, but she didn't make a sound. He shifted her carefully into the seat, adjusting her legs with both hands until she sat square. She was light, but not fragile. Her arms steadied against the chair's side rails as she looked down at the footrest, the narrow width, the way the chair sat balanced on 4 low casters. Adam stepped back. She placed both palms on the wooden arms and pushed once. The chair rolled forward a foot, slightly uneven on the right side. She tested the resistance again, then turned it with a small push from one hand. He watched her take the movement in without speaking. Her face remained unreadable, but her eyes didn't drift. They tracked the room now, measured space. He knelt, adjusted a bolt on the lower strut. "It favors the left," he said. "I'll learn it," she replied. He nodded once, stood, and turned to grab the file. She moved again, this time on her own, rotating the chair slowly to face the open part of the room. Her arms weren't fast, but they were controlled, deliberate. Every push was a test, not a plea. Adam filed down a splinter on the side rail while she adjusted her seat. When he was done, he handed her the folded blanket that had been on the cot. She took it and set it across her knees without comment. For the first time since she'd arrived, she wasn't lying down. She wasn't on the floor. She was upright, mobile. He walked to the door and opened it, letting in a gust of crisp air that cut straight through the cabin. She didn't flinch. The ramp outside had held through the night. He checked it again, more out of habit than concern. Board still firm, angle steady. He stood aside. "You want to try it?" he asked. Taya didn't hesitate. She rolled forward, corrected the slight veer to the left, and reached the threshold. The ramp waited. Adam didn't touch her, didn't offer help. She placed her hands on the wheels, paused, then pushed. The chair moved down the slope, smooth and steady. Her eyes were fixed straight ahead, her posture straightened by control, not pride. At the bottom, she turned in the dirt and rolled toward the sunlit corner of the yard. Adam stayed at the top of the ramp. She stopped by the chicken pen, rested her hands on her thighs, and looked back toward the cabin. A nod passed between them. That was it. He went back inside. She stayed out there a while. Not because she needed to, but because she could. By the fourth day, the fog had cleared completely, but the cold stayed sharp. Adam stood behind the barn with a rusted pail in one hand and a hammer in the other, knocking loose a bent hinge from the feed door. His jacket was button high, collar turned up, but his hands were bare. He couldn't work through gloves. The sound of each strike carried far in the dry air. A crow passed overhead, wings cutting the stillness, but Adam didn't look up. Across the yard, near the porch, Taya sat quietly in her chair, her back straight against the rail slats he'd sanded down smooth that morning. A blanket was folded across her legs, but she didn't pull it up. She held a basket across her lap with a small pile of beans in one half and a growing cluster of clean husks in the other. Her hands moved with practiced rhythm, slow, certain, steady. They hadn't spoken since breakfast. She'd taken to sitting outside for hours now. He never asked why, but she made use of the ramp like it had always been there. The chair rolled fine on packed dirt. She adjusted her course when the terrain pulled left, and when it dipped near the fence posts, she reached down and caught herself with the tips of her fingers against the wheel spokes. Adam hadn't seen a misstep yet. He replaced the hinge, sealed the feed door, and returned the hammer to its place on the barn peg. When he turned, he saw her glance toward the west trail, brief, cautious. Then he heard it too. Hoofbeats, distant but coming fast. Not ranchers, not freight. Too light for wagons. Adam crossed the yard without a word and stepped up onto the porch. He stood beside Taya without making a sound. She stopped shelling beans. 3 riders came into view, cutting through the brush like they'd done it before. Boys. Young, clean coats, dust on their boots from the trail, not the yard. One carried a shotgun over his shoulder. None of them looked surprised to see someone on the property. Adam didn't move. Taya watched them come, her hands frozen mid-shell. The lead boy, tall, maybe 20, reined in first. The horse shifted under him, agitated from the sharp pull. The boy looked over at Taya, then at Adam. "Well, damn," he said, too loud for the space between them. "She's still here." Adam said nothing. The boy laughed once, shallow. "Didn't figure you'd keep her." The one behind him, shorter and wider, spit to the side. "Figured she'd crawl off." Taya's face didn't change. Adam stepped down one stair. The third boy, the quietest of the bunch, held the reins tighter than needed. His eyes darted between the porch and the trees behind it. He didn't speak. Adam stopped 3 paces from the porch, his arms at his sides. The rifle wasn't slung over his shoulder today. It leaned inside the doorway, close but not visible. "I don't want you back here," Adam said. His voice was low, dry. It wasn't a threat. It was a closing. The tall one grinned. "We didn't touch nothing." Adam's stare didn't shift. "You will leave," he said. "We just came to see if the cripple could still blink." That broke the air. Taya didn't speak, but her shoulders stiffened slightly. Her hands closed slowly around the edges of the basket. The wind kicked up behind her, loose dirt lifting across the yard. Adam's boots moved once. He walked straight past the horse, past the grin, past the cocky slouch in the saddle. He didn't raise his hands, didn't speed up. He just walked straight to the barn, opened the door, and came back holding something. It wasn't a rifle. It was the post. The same rusted mailbox post they had left her tied to. He had ripped it from the ground the night after he brought her inside, never thinking what he'd do with it. But he'd kept it behind the barn, leaned against the wall like an ugly memory that hadn't gone to rest yet. He set it down in the dirt in front of the horses. Didn't say a word. The tall boy's grin faded. The quiet one shifted in his saddle. "You can keep it," Adam said. "Don't bring it back." Nobody moved. Adam didn't flinch. He looked each of them in the face, eyes hard, steady, not daring them, just ending them. One by one, they turned their horses. No back talk, no flair. The boy with the shotgun said something under his breath, but the others didn't answer. They rode off the same trail they came in, dust rising behind them. When the sound of hoofbeats faded, Adam picked up the post again and walked it to the back of the barn. This time, he threw it down flat, not leaning, not saving. He shut the barn door and walked back to the porch. Taya hadn't moved. Her fingers were back to the beans, slow again, no rush in her touch. "They won't come back," he said as he stepped onto the porch. She didn't look at him. "I know," she said quietly. That night, he fixed the draft under the west window. Taya rolled herself beside the stove, warming her arms while the stew simmered low. He passed her a piece of bread with the crust still hard, and she ate without needing it softened. Afterward, they sat across from each other in the firelight, the chair wheels locked in place, his legs stretched out, the floor creaking faintly under their weight. Neither spoke, but the silence had changed again. Not stiff, not heavy, settled, real, and earned. Wind pressed against the cabin that morning with a different kind of weight. Not violent, but full. It moved the frost across the yard like smoke and left the porch rails coated in ice. Adam pushed the door open with his shoulder, holding a small burlap sack of flour in one arm. He'd walked to the trading post before sunup, made the trip in less than 2 hours, and returned with just the essentials: flour, salt, a new file for the saw, and a spool of thick thread. He hadn't told Taya he was going. She hadn't asked where he went. When he stepped inside, the warmth from the stove hadn't reached her yet. She sat at the table near the window, arms crossed tightly over her chest, chair angled to catch the limited sunlight that broke through the cloud-streaked sky. Her hair was tied back in a rough bun. Strands framed her face, and the blanket had fallen from her lap onto the floorboards. She hadn't picked it up. Adam shut the door behind him and dropped the sack onto the counter. A few grains spilled onto the wood and disappeared into the cracks. He removed his coat, hung it on the hook beside the stove, and picked up the thread spool. Taya didn't turn toward him, but she spoke without raising her voice. "Did you trade anything?" He set the spool down gently on the table. "No," he said. "Paid cash." That seemed to satisfy her. She lowered her arms and wheeled backward, giving him room to pass. For a long stretch, they didn't say anything. The rhythm of the place returned, quiet, deliberate, filled with practical sounds. The pan warmed on the stove. Water hissed into the kettle, which shifted inside the iron belly of the heater. She rolled to the basin, dipped a cloth in warm water, and began wiping the table surface where old crumbs had settled. That was new. Adam didn't comment. Later, she opened the chest at the end of the bed, the one he hadn't touched in over 3 years, and pulled out a folded length of cotton. It had belonged to his mother, long before either of the brothers inherited the house. The fabric was thin but clean. She unfolded it, measured it against her chest, and then, without asking, began tearing it into sections. Adam paused, tools in hand, watching her from across the room. "What for?" he asked. "I'm making something," she replied. Her voice didn't carry a challenge. It wasn't defensive. It was matter of fact. He let it be. Over the next hour, she worked steadily, needle between fingers, thread pulled through fabric with careful tension. Her hands were fast, the kind of fast that came from repetition, not show. She didn't pin or measure formally. She didn't need to. She worked by instinct, eyes narrowed slightly in focus, jaw tight from the cold. Adam finished reinforcing the chair's left wheel mount, then set his tools down and moved to the window. Outside, 2 does stepped into the yard near the woodpile. Their hooves cracked the frost beneath them. He watched them a moment before they darted off again, startled by a sudden gust of wind. Behind him, Taya exhaled sharply. Not for frustration, more like satisfaction. She held up the cloth now, shaped into something new. An apron. It wasn't fancy. The stitching wasn't perfect, but it had a clean neck loop, 2 pocket flaps, and enough length to reach past her knees. She didn't wait for approval. She tied it around her waist, rolled herself toward the stove, and began pulling out ingredients. He stepped aside without a word. That evening, they didn't eat in silence. Not much was said, but sounds filled the space. Her knife tapping against the cutting board, the spoon stirring broth, the low scrape of metal on the skillet edge. She portioned food onto 2 plates and handed it across the table. Her hands were steady. He accepted it without comment. When they sat down, she spoke first. "I used to do this with my brothers." Adam took a bite before answering. "How many?" "2. Older. One's dead. The other stayed behind." He didn't ask what happened. She didn't offer more. The meal was good. He hadn't tasted anything close to seasoned in months. She'd used a dried bundle from the shelf he hadn't touched in years, bay leaf, and some cracked pepper. There was a faint hint of heat at the back of his throat when he swallowed. When they finished, she cleared both plates. Adam stayed seated, watching the way her shoulders moved as she rinsed the tin dishes. She wasn't quick, but she didn't hesitate. Her arms had grown stronger. He noticed how easily she turned in the chair now, how her movements no longer carried caution but habit. He rose finally and stepped outside to smoke the stub of an old hand-rolled cigarette. He leaned against the porch rail, watching clouds slide over the moon. His fingers ached from the day's work. The cold didn't help. Behind him, through the window, the cabin glowed with warm light. She moved around it freely. Not fast, not perfect, but with ownership. He took one last drag, crushed the stub under his boot, and stood still for a while longer before heading in. She was already near the cot, unfolding her blanket. He crossed the room, grabbed the second quilt from the shelf, and tossed it to her lap without comment. She looked up, caught it easily, and nodded once. That night, she didn't sleep on the cot. She stayed in the chair, pulled close to the fire, apron still tied around her waist. Adam didn't question it. Some things didn't need words. The first snow arrived 2 days before expected. Thin flakes at first, light, scattered, falling without sound. But by mid-morning, the wind had shifted south, and the sky took on that dull, bruised color Adam recognized from long winters past. The woodpile was still low. He had meant to haul more from the ridge by week's end. Now, his plans had narrowed to hours. Taya sat near the front window, a wool shawl around her shoulders, eyes fixed on the clouds crawling down from the mountains. Her breath fogged the glass each time she leaned close. Her lap held a folded cloth bundle. Inside it, a stack of lined paper and a graphite pencil that had worn to half length. She'd found them in the drawer beside the cupboard 2 nights ago and hadn't let them out of sight since. Adam laced his boots without looking up. "You stay inside today," he said. She didn't argue. He didn't wait for a response. By noon, he'd loaded the mule cart with rope, a hatchet, and an empty crate. The trees along the northern slope held older wood, dry and thick, but reaching them would take a few hours round trip, and the trail would ice over fast if the snow deepened. He took his rifle, not for trouble, just for form. Taya watched him from the porch until the slope swallowed his silhouette. Then she turned back inside. Alone now, the cabin sounded different. Every small creak, every pop from the stove seemed louder in his absence. She rolled her chair near the table, unfolded the cloth, and placed a blank sheet in front of her. Her fingers hesitated over the pencil. She wasn't sure why she was writing. No one was waiting for a letter. No one to send it to. But her body needed the motion, something to mark the day beyond silence. She began with her name, just the letters, carefully formed. Then she paused. Her last name no longer felt like something she needed. She crossed it out. Her handwriting was neat. Small curves, sharp turns. She wrote slow, testing each word as if it might betray her if given too quickly. "I was left here, on the post by the road. You know that already. But maybe you didn't know why. Or maybe it doesn't matter anymore." The pencil tip snapped. She set it down, reached for the knife on the shelf, and sharpened it against the stone the way Adam had shown her. She didn't ask him to teach her that. She just watched one evening, then tried herself. She wrote again. "I couldn't walk. That was enough for them to decide I was done. Not worth feeding. Not worth carrying. Not worth the shame. They laughed when they tied me. Said a white man wouldn't care. Said no one would stop them." She stopped there, pushed the chair back, rolled toward the stove, poked at the fire, added a small log. The warmth returned slowly, pushing back the cold that had crept into the corners. After a while, she returned to the table and began again. "He didn't ask who I was. Just picked me up and carried me like it was part of his routine. Like I belonged here already. He didn't make a speech. Didn't promise anything. He just didn't walk away." Her eyes stung. She pressed her wrist against them and waited. Outside, wind scraped across the glass. The snow had thickened. It coated the porch steps, drifted along the barn roof, buried the cart tracks Adam had left behind. There was no sound of hooves, no creak of a gate. Only the stove and the slow turn of pages under her fingers. She began writing again. "I thought maybe he was just doing what good men are supposed to do." But days passed, then weeks. and he never once looked at me like I was a chore. I can see the difference. He moves quiet, fixes things, brings water before I ask. He built me a ramp without asking if I needed one. She paused, then added, he calls me nothing. Not girl, not miss, not burden. Just brings me things and leaves them near, like it's natural I should have them. The chair creaked as she shifted. Her legs had no feeling below the hips, but she could tell when her body had slumped. She sat up again, spine straight, breath drawn through her nose. Another line. They'll say I stayed because I had nowhere else. But I stayed because he never asked me to leave. A sound interrupted her. Not the door, not the window. Footsteps. She turned quickly, wheels rattling against the floor. Adam stepped inside, coat soaked through the shoulders, beard damp, gloves darkened from handling snow. He looked at her first, then at the table, then the stove. You eat? He asked. She shook her head. He nodded once, pulled off his coat, and hung it near the stove. The crate of wood sat just outside the door. He dragged it himself, left the mule in the lean-to. It would be hours before he felt warmth again. She rolled back from the table and opened the cupboard, pulling down the iron pot. I'll cook, she said. He didn't argue. As she worked, adding dried beans, slicing the last of the onion, Adam sat at the table and picked up the folded paper. She froze, but he didn't unfold it. He placed it aside, neatly beside the empty tin cup. I won't read it, he said. Her shoulders eased. I didn't write it for anyone, she said. He understood. The snow pressed against the windows harder now, stacking against the sill. She ladled stew into 2 bowls. He took his with both hands and didn't comment on the taste. She didn't ask if it was all right. After dinner, she pushed herself beside the fire and took the blanket from the cot. Adam moved the chair closer to the stove. The distance between them shortened without discussion. Outside, the wind carried on. Inside, the silence meant something different. There was no debt between them, no bargain, just presence. And every hour it continued without break. Without question, it became something closer to permanence. Snow hadn't let up in 3 days. The yard disappeared beneath it, the fences swallowed, the trail out to the ridge erased. Every morning, Adam stepped outside and shoveled a narrow path to the barn. Every evening, he stomped the same trench deeper, the wind undoing half his work before he'd even turned back. The cold had settled into everything. Boards creaked underfoot, even when no one moved. Nails shrank in their holes. The stove had to be fed every 3 hours to keep the walls from frosting inside. They didn't complain. That wasn't the kind of house this was. Adam patched the roof between squalls. Taya mended clothes with the last of the thread. Meals came from whatever stores hadn't gone soft or moldy. They rationed firewood, but never warmth. That morning, Adam found a break in the southern fence. He'd gone out early with a lantern, eyes narrowed against the wind. The fence stretched wide along the pasture edge, sagging from age, nailed together over years with what he had on hand. Half the southern stretch leaned too far east now. One post had snapped at the base and lay buried under snow. A gap that wide meant coyotes, or worse. He didn't say anything when he came back inside, only peeled off his outer coat and set it beside the stove. His hands were red to the wrist, fingers slow. Taya noticed. She stood near the basin, wringing out a cloth, her lips pale from the morning chill. Fence? She asked. He nodded once. Bad. He poured coffee into a tin mug before answering. Needs replacing. She didn't press for details. Later, while she sorted dry beans for supper, he brought out the spare post stacked under the lean-to, his shoulders hunched against the blowing snow. The nails he'd stored in a rusted tin were still good. The hammerhead had cracked along the grip, but he wrapped it in leather and used it anyway. Each strike echoed differently in the cold. Muffled, dull, but he worked clean, driving nails deep into fresh wood with no wasted motion. From the porch, she watched him. She didn't offer help. Couldn't. Not in the ways the job demanded. But she stayed visible, her presence constant. After the third post, he came in for water. His breath left him in thick clouds. His beard had frosted at the edges. She rolled forward and held out a towel before he asked. He wiped his face and sank onto the bench by the wall, breathing shallow. She reached behind her and handed him a boiled potato wrapped in a cloth napkin, still warm. He took it without speaking. "You think they'll come back?" she asked. He glanced at her, surprised. "Who?" "The boys." He took another bite, chewed slowly. "Not in this weather." She nodded, then wheeled to the stove and added more wood. "Come spring." Adam didn't answer at first. He looked down at the floorboards, tracing the grain with his eyes, then met hers. "If they do," he said, "I'll be ready." She didn't smile, didn't nod, but the air shifted. Later, when he returned to the fence, she worked from the window, sewing a pocket into the side of the chair. Her stitching had improved. Tight, straight. She looped a strap through the armrest and knotted it twice. Inside the pocket, she slid a small folded knife. Dull but pointed, her hands didn't tremble when she secured the clasp. By the time the sun lowered behind the ridge, Adam had set 5 new posts and stretched wire between them. His gloves were soaked. His knee ached. He limped heavier than usual coming back in. She handed him a rag for his boots before he even asked. He took it and sat on a stool by the door. "You see anything?" she asked. "No tracks. No movement." "That's good." He looked up. "You thinking about leaving?" She turned slightly in the chair. "No." He let out a slow breath. "Just wondering," she said, "how long this quiet lasts." He wiped his boots, hung the rag by the door, then crossed to the table and pulled out the chair. "Quiet doesn't mean it's safe," he said. "No, but it's better than what we had before." This time, she nodded. They ate in silence again, but it wasn't empty. The weight between them was different now. Not tension, something closer to agreement. When she cleared the dishes, he moved to the back room. From a crate beneath the cot, he pulled out an old canvas sack. Inside were items he hadn't touched since his brother died. Old cavalry gear, a second revolver, bullets wrapped in oilcloth, a folded paper with their last homestead taxes, unpaid. He brought it to the kitchen and set it on the table. Taya looked at the bag, then at him. "Don't want surprises," he said. She understood. They spent the rest of the evening preparing without saying that's what they were doing. She cleaned the rifle parts one by one. He packed dry food into canvas rolls. A second kettle was filled and left on the stove to heat water faster overnight. Nothing was said of danger. Nothing was predicted. But the way they moved said everything. Later, as the snow thickened again and wind howled against the shutters, they sat near the fire. Adam on the bench, Taya in her chair, hands folded in her lap. "I wasn't meant to stay alive," she said quietly. He didn't look away. "I didn't think I'd care again." He shifted forward, elbows on his knees. "You do now." She met his eyes. "I think I already did." He gave a single nod, then stood, went to the shelf, pulled down the tin of dried apples, opened it, handed her one. She took it, bit down, and chewed slowly. Neither spoke again that night. But for the first time since she'd arrived, the word home stopped feeling foreign. The storm passed during the night. By morning, the sky had cleared. A pale sun pushed through the frost-thick clouds, turning the snow into a hard crust that cracked under Adam's boots as he stepped across the yard. His breath came out slow and white. The wind had stopped completely. Everything looked still. No movement from the tree line, no coyote prints near the coop, just clean white and a silence too, even a trust. He reached the barn and opened the doors carefully. The mule, restless after 2 nights inside, pawed the ground and let out a low snort. Adam fed her, checked the boards, and leaned against the stall for a moment longer than usual. Something felt finished. Inside the cabin, Taya boiled water for laundry. She had taken over more of the routine without discussion, cutting onions, mending sleeves, folding towels by the stove. The chair, once unfamiliar, now followed a clear pattern through the small space. Its path worn smooth across the wooden planks. Her hands moved efficiently, sleeves rolled, sleeves tied at the elbow with scraps of cotton. She wasn't adjusting to the place anymore. She belonged to it now. Adam came in with his coat stiff from cold. She glanced over her shoulder once to check his face. No words, just a small nod. She returned to pouring water into the wash basin. He unhooked his hat, set it on the peg, and stood near the door, warming his palms over the fire. "Fence held," he said. She rinsed a rag and didn't look up. "Good." He walked to the counter, reached for the last jar of pickled beets, and turned it over in his hand. We'll need more supplies before spring. I'll make a list. That was the shape of them now. Two people moving side by side, without needing to name what had formed between. Around noon, the crunch of hooves shattered the quiet. Adam stiffened. Taya wheeled herself toward the window. 3 riders approached from the southern slope. One of them holding a sack over his shoulder, another carrying a long rifle across his lap. Their horses moved slow, deliberate, not wandering. Not kids. Adam moved to the cabinet and removed the old Colt he hadn't used since before she arrived. He checked the chamber out of habit, then rested it on the table within reach. His stance didn't change. He waited. Taya said nothing, but her hands closed tightly around the arms of her chair. The knock came soft, measured. Adam opened the door halfway, keeping his weight balanced on a frame. A man in his 40s stood there, coat too clean, eyes sharp, beard trimmed like someone who still visited town for appearances. "You Adam Harrow?" the man asked. Adam nodded. "Name's Lane Trask. Marshal out of Silver Bluff." Adam didn't move. "You ride this far for trouble?" "No, sir. For clarity." The marshal looked past him. Not at Taya, not at the rifle. At the floor, the doorway, the weight in the silence. "Boys from Wither Hollow are being held. Word is they left a woman tied up on your property. She pressed charges." Adam didn't answer. Trask stepped back, lifted the sack, and handed it to him. Their folks pooled together to pay restitution. More worried about the name of the town than the harm done. "I'm not here to argue, just to deliver." Adam didn't take the sack. Behind him, Taya rolled forward, stopping just short of the doorframe. "I didn't ask for money," she said, voice low but even. Trask looked at her, not shocked. "No, ma'am, but it's yours just the same." She stared at him for several seconds, then at Adam. "Do we need it?" Adam watched her face. "No," he said. She backed away. The marshal stood quiet for a breath, then lowered the sack to the porch. "Well then," he muttered, "guess that's that." He tipped his hat and turned. The other riders followed him without a word. They left the sack behind. Adam closed the door and didn't speak. Taya rolled to the fire, pulled the kettle closer, and stirred it once with a wooden spoon. "They didn't care what happened to me," she said. "Just what people heard about it." Adam picked up the sack, set it on the table, and walked back to the stove. "No one's gonna touch you again." She didn't thank him. She didn't have to. That night, the wind picked up again. Not sharp, not dangerous, just enough to move the shutters and rattle the loose tin on the coop roof. Adam sat on the bench with a cup of coffee gone cold in his hand. Taya moved beside him. For a long while, neither spoke. Then she set her hand on his knee, fingers resting gently, as if testing the gesture for weight. "I'd like to stay," she said. He didn't move, didn't blink. "You already have." She turned her head toward him, eyes steady. "I mean, really stay." He didn't answer right away. He looked around the cabin, at the chair, the stove, the cracked beams he'd meant to fix last summer, at her blanket folded on the cot, at the rope hooks near the pantry where she'd hung her apron. Every inch of the place now carried her presence. She wasn't passing through. She'd never been a guest. He reached for her hand and held it. "No more halfway," he said. She squeezed once, firm, then leaned her head lightly against his shoulder. Outside, the snow finally stopped. And for the first time in years, Adam didn't mark the hour by how much work was left undone. He marked it by who was with him, still, steady, choosing to remain. Not out of need, not for mercy, but because home wasn't what you built. It was what you stayed for.